The stock market is a collective of buyers and sellers of stock, sometimes called shares. Each individual stock not being a physical object of purchase, but a monetary investment representing partial ownership and claim to a business. Investing in the stock market to many can seem to resemble a gambling game, and the economically volatile times that have erupted over the past year have shed light on the not so well kept secrets of some of the world's most wealthy individuals. There's an old joke from the German Democratic Republic. So, a worker gets a job in Siberia, understanding that all of his mail is going to be read by authorities when he's there. So, him and his friends decide that when they write to each other, they will use blue ink when they are telling the truth, and they will use red ink when what they're telling is a lie. The first letter is received, and it's written in blue ink. And it says, "Everything is wonderful here. The grocery stores are always full, my apartment has running water, and a very nice heater. There's always the best Western films being shown at the cinema, and the girls here are gorgeous. The only problem is, they do not sell red ink." The red ink here symbolizes the tools necessary to achieve our goals, and it's this inability to obtain these tools that stops us from completing them. If this were the 20th century in the West, the old Marxists would want the means of production in the hands of the working class. But what does the average American who's lived their whole life under the American ideology in 2020 want for the working class? In June of 2020, Forbes reported on the unexpected soaring stock of Hertz, a company that had just filed for bankruptcy the month prior. Normally, stock like this would continue to decrease in value due to it being intrinsically worthless, according to Forbes. Many of the largest brokers began to question why so many people would flock to stock exchange and investments when in the United States, unemployment was at one of the highest percentages, reportedly as low as 13% and as high as 16%. In this time period, brokers like Schwab, TDA, Fidelity, and Interactive saw an unexpected spike in new accounts being opened and traded with as the COVID-19 pandemic ravaged the globe. Unfortunately for them, hindsight is 2020, and their speculations come off as out of touch, considering the very ideology that they perpetuate in the United States, and how it shapes the average American's perceptions of money, employment, and relationships to others. Many often chalking this rise in activity up to gamblers finding a new outlet or sports bettors finding a new sport to bet on, so to speak. What Wall Street executive types fail to understand is that this reaction from the general public to take their chance on the market when they're down on their luck is the exact message that's pushed upon them by society. Take responsibility for your life. Pick yourself up by your bootstraps. Rise and grind. And so on, right? These sentiments of self-responsibility feed off an already established culture of masculinity in the West, but specifically nostalgic masculinity. Now, think about these words and what they mean. We'll return to this idea further on. It's going to play a critical role. Having been, and currently still, a dominating tool in rallying many in the United States since the 1980s. With the advent of the internet and increased accessibility throughout the 1990s, we saw what was called the dot-com boom, bringing with it an entirely new speed in which to communicate and organize. Marxists across the globe reveled in the potential that this would have for bringing about the workers' revolution that they had dreamed about for over 2 centuries. But what actually happened, and what could have ever happened? As the old saying goes, every problem has in it the seeds of its own solution. So true is the opposite of that phrase. Since the moment the internet went live, we've seen an explosion of right-wing organization and acts of terror on a size and scale we've never seen before. Within the past decade alone, we've seen online message forums create subgroups of right-wing politics called the alt-right, who specifically wish to target and harass women and minorities, to keep the list extremely brief. Organized rallies such as the Unite the Right rally arise in activity from right-wing paramilitary groups and a very large following for alternative news, which has mostly appeared to be funneled through social media as hearsay at best and conspiracy theory at worst, culminating in the creation of the cultural monolith of Donald Trump. I say monolith because the views of him from the left and the right have skewed, making him into a caricature reflective of their personal ideological differences. In reality, Donald Trump, the person, is a product of the neoliberal society he helped create. And if you hold yourself up as a Democrat, you may want to see him as the devil misogynist, a crony businessman giving all the good rich people a bad name. He now symbolizes the greedy, egotistical villain. And if you see yourself as a Republican, you want to see him as a smart, financially focused man who says things as they are. He may be misogynistic, but what does that have to do with politics anyway? Bill Clinton is still on the good side of the Democrats, right? He now symbolizes the tragic hero. And just like that, these two straw men before us have created a monolith, a person who is no longer a person, but an object that represents something we recognize as either a problem or a solution for our broken society. Let's get to the purpose of all of this. The lead-up and subsequent fallout of the 2020 election left in its wake a shift in national attention. On the one hand, you have a left-wing response to the ravaging pandemic that was very quickly silenced simply by ignoring their concerns and demands. The market remained open, unemployment rose, and the death toll still skyrocketing. Conditions like these feel like they could bring forth the guillotines, but unlike our 18th century counterparts, we have far left the ideals of God and country, divine right, and the duty to our fellow countrymen. On the other, we have right-wing ideals. Those of nostalgic masculinity have taken the reins, and those beliefs have asked, what would your ancestors who fought wars do? And what must you do to survive? This is all you have. Naturally, looking to those at the top of the economic pile for advice, they went to message forums, took what money they had, and began to let their resentments for the establishment fuel their desires. So, before the alarms of revolution can be rung at the sight of working class banding together, I'll take up the task of analyzing the political and social climates, laying the groundwork for the events that unfolded, how the recent technological revolution mirrors that of the Industrial Revolution, fueling anti-establishment sentiments and populist movements. Because right-wing ideas have a firm grasp on our society, it only leads to right-wing populism, which could create a violent environment for our culture in the coming years. Oh yeah, put on that fresh sweater, cause it's cold. When analyzing the events of January 2021, it would be best for us to consider everything surrounding that led up to the major socioeconomic events that were rallied under the banner of populism. History is often given meaning retroactively, and it's through that lens which we should probably consider them. Using history as a tool, hopefully giving them greater magnitude to the events as they relate to us right now, and how they may result in the future. Money. Here taken as the independent expression of a certain amount of value existing either actually as money or as commodities, may be converted into capital on the basis of capitalist production, and may thereby be transformed from a given value to a self-expanding or self-increasing value. It produces profit, i.e., it enables the capitalist to extract a certain quantity of unpaid labor, surplus product, and surplus value from the laborers, and to appropriate it. Its use value then consists precisely in the profit it produces when converted into capital. In this capacity of potential capital as a means of producing profit, it becomes a commodity, but a commodity sui generis. Or, what amounts to the same, capital as capital becomes a commodity. The stock market's been an aspect of our economy since its modern creation by the Dutch East India Company during the early 1600s in Amsterdam. To raise their capital, the Dutch East India Company decided to sell stock and pay dividends of the shares to investors. This sent a ripple effect through Europe as more and more countries set up their own stock exchanges, and more businesses were eager to go public. The excitement behind all the potential returns and accrued capital, unfortunately, made many go blind with greed, as they poured more and more wealth into the market. Financial instability soon followed, and in 1720, investors started to pull from the markets in mass exodus. The problem being that no one was in the position to buy their stock, and the market crashed. As previously stated, the stock market's a form of exchange where investors throw their money in a sort of gambling arena, pitting the economic wealth of businesses in an industry against each other. But many day traders will try and convince you otherwise. Bradford Cornell, an emeritus finance professor at UCLA, measures the role of luck by comparing the greater dispersion of short-term versus long-term returns. His rationale is that when focusing on a given group of managers, the bigger range of their short-term returns is due entirely to luck. But there's another side to this betting game. As it makes sense to wager money on a winner, so to speak, what if someone were to make a wager that in hopes a company would depreciate in value? In 1822, Jacob Little, known as the Great Bear of Wall Street, started shorting stocks in the market, a process which requires borrowing stock from a company and selling it in hopes that the price of that stock will decrease. So, when you buy the stock back, you keep the difference for yourself. But seeing this negative kind of stock market betting makes sense when you think about the lengths that capitalism encourages those to be competitive. And the lengths those will go to remain competitive will often go past what seems common sense. I mean, say what you will, but being able to find a way to make profit off of someone else's shortcomings might not line up morally with what we expect, but within the goals of capitalism being to create as much wealth as possible, it's kind of genius. Shorting still, like every other investment strategy, is not without its own risk and economic contradictions. If you're watching this in early 2021, I'm sure you've heard and seen enough of this being subjected to explanations of economics and the stock market, not so dissimilar to what's happening right now. I'm sorry, it has a point, I swear. Okay, but I promise I will not be explaining any stock market strategies any further. This is all you need to know. And now that we understand the basics of what we need to know, we can go further into the political economy of January 2021. The fun stuff. On the week of January the 25th, 2021, stock prices for GameStop, AMC Theaters, and Nokia, just to name a few, started to see high volumes of investments. With the COVID-19 pandemic ravaging on and so many of these companies losing business to online sales, losing out to other competition, it seemed rather odd. Looking back, months prior in 2020, investment collectives had been using this as a perfect opportunity, so they started shorting stock as we discussed and defined previously. Being a relatively low risk by all strategic economic understandings, as all these businesses had been hit by either changing markets or pandemic restrictions, these collectives began the process of shorting these stocks. Meanwhile, online, since the beginning of the pandemic, many people had taken up day trading as a way to take a chance on the free market, gathering together on message boards, most prominently being r/Wall Street Bets, now infamous for being the face of small investors, or as pundits and commentators have branded them, the little guy. Forum users collaborated for months in day trading speculation and casual market research, leading some to discover leaked information that certain hedge funds were shorting stock. Redditors, as they are called online and by the media, began to slowly start buying up these stocks for months leading up to the market-disrupting event that started the week of January the 25th. Culminating in the morning of January 28th with some of the stock topping out nearly at 1,600% increase. The internet and media were buzzing the entire week, talking in excitement about what this meant. Collaboration of the little guy to take on large investment collectives. Words such as socialism, class consciousness, class warfare, and even in some cases anarchist were being thrown around. These words even finding themselves on mainstream news media, but usually in a darker, more fear-mongering tone. Social media leftists and right-wing libertarians found themselves in agreement. And on that day, world peace was achieved. They could work together and take a sizable amount of wealth from large companies and put it directly into the hands of the working class. While mainstream media chose to paint those online as greedy, misguided, and socialist. Why do they always use socialism for a scary word? I'm gonna go Joker. It's my Joker arc. Oh, they really aren't. This has a lot less to do with left-wing ideals, I promise. We'll get into it. Nonetheless, these words made their way into mainstream public sphere in America for the second time in 1 month. And the question we now have to answer is, what does that mean for us? Unfortunately, I don't believe it means a whole lot. The sentiments from those gathering on Reddit and message boards affiliated come from liberalism, an ideology used in the creation of nations against monarchies throughout the centuries, transforming feudalism to capitalism. Liberalism has been there every step of the way, and still is. It's by this very way of thinking that brought about the nation that I live in today. And it's this very way of thinking that transformed into the prevailing ideology of today in the West. We'll explore why and how this transformed over the decades and decades, the real conditions people have faced and currently face, all of this leading to a conflict of interest between the people of nations and the governing officials. I want to leave on an observation from a Marxist who is very near and dear to me, Rosa Luxemburg. We are still on Marx's assumption within the bounds of simple reproduction, the capitalist class. That is to say, use the whole of their surplus value for personal consumption.
since the capitalists are the consumers of surplus value. Luxemburg here takes the time to explain how the contradictions of capitalism can play into its downfall. When you look further into how something like investments or stock exchange actually work, they really do more to reinforce and prolong the system rather than take it down. In regards to my original thesis, populism has become a more viable form of politics as instability and distrust in governing bodies and financial institutions rises. And as populism increases, we will see more right-wing populist movements and populists become more prevalent. Specifically in the United States, the political spectrum is very skewed to the right, and therefore left-wing populism is dramatically more difficult to become influential outside of political minority factions. The leftist revolution will not be day traded. Economic ideals are still rooted in liberalism, but when we consider every aspect, how do social ideals hold up and compare?
Whew, glad I'm out of that monkey suit.
Guy Debord was a French Marxist who tackled one of capitalism's most difficult defenses for self-preservation, its adaptability. Extensively writing about how capitalism presents itself in a highly industrialized post-World War II society, such as the United States, coming to the idea that when enough accumulation occurs, it stops being a physical thing, but presents itself as images or spectacles. In the third chapter of his book, Society of the Spectacle, he specifically describes how capitalism has taken conflicting roles in our society, such as the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or the ruling class and the working class, integrating and commodifying the struggle. As discussed previously, the excitement around the little guy fighting back against Wall Street gave many American leftists hope in class consciousness, some going as far as to even refer to this as class warfare. But what many forget is that things like this have happened before, and organization of working class individuals has happened on much larger scales in the past. During the 1960s, when Debord was writing The Society of the Spectacle, a new leftist movement was shaking France called the New Left Movement. Some of the very issues that we were seeing, Debord had already written about. Just as it presents pseudo-goods to be coveted, it offers false models of revolution to local revolutionaries. The bureaucratic regimes in power in certain industrialized countries have their own particular type of spectacle, but it is an integral part of the total spectacle, serving as its pseudo-opposition and actual support. Almost as if for the struggle and conflict to remain unchallenged, capitalism adapted to create these pseudo-conflicts. For those inclined to be class conscious as kind of an outlet for them so that they can challenge the system and feel satisfied, but ultimately change nothing. Allowing the system to remain unchanged may seem like I'm describing like a sinister worldview, an orchestration of like a big scary other, whether it be quote-unquote incoming dog whistles, elites, shadow government, cabal, etc., etc. And I don't want to give like the feeling that whatever people do is in vain to, fight the system and whatnot. I just wish for those who do want to make change to look at the wider picture, look at our actions, consider the ends wanted, and if the means being used actually have the ability to accomplish those ends. But what does a wider look have to consider, though? We know what our goals are. The problems that we see are problems that still exist, are they not? And even if everyone doesn't agree on the same political ideology, we all see where those problems originate, right? So therefore, the solutions should eventually synchronize, right? In Undoing the Demos, Neoliberalism's Stealth Revolution by Wendy Brown, they take a deep dive analyzing neoliberalism in what it is, what it does, and how it affects us from day to day. My particular copy is very bookmarked. I have loved this book to pieces. I highly recommend. How we view people around us, ourselves, and ultimately the powers that dictate most of our lives. They write on how neoliberalism is notoriously hard to pinpoint and becomes more of a I know it when I see it kind of attitude. Even academically, it doesn't have exactly fixed or settled coordinates in the political spectrum, political charting sort of way. But we can generally understand it as an economic policy, a modality of governance, and an order of reason is at once a global phenomenon, yet inconsistent, differentiated, unsystematic, impure. And it's this elusiveness that has shown to be a strength of neoliberalism, being able to implement itself into various forms of governments in various different political climates since the end of World War II. Often it's discussed through the lens of 1980s America and the UK through Reagan and Thatcher, but this can also overlook the way it's infiltrated and affected countries around the world, specifically those in socialist nations around the time when the Soviet Union collapsed. Slavoj Žižek will often bring up the fact that the ultimate irony is that while former communists are today the best managers of capitalism, this slow movement and shift of economic and foreign policy has had its effect globally, and has done so in a way of normalizing its tactics for accomplishing its goals. But back here in the United States, the effects of neoliberalism have brought about 4 very distinct and observable points of critique that are unique to its values. From these, we can start to understand and define it. Neoliberalism is often visible through its use of economic policies that do the most to create free markets. Deregulations of industry and capital movement, extremely decreasing social programs designed to protect vulnerable citizens, privatization of public goods, whether that be education, shared land, infrastructure, prisons, and militarized forces, stopping all wealth redistribution, either being in social or economic policy, and turning any person's desires or needs into an economic industry. But while these are noticeable, the I know it when I see it mentality is a perspective that only notices the symptoms of these problems, not the source. Firstly, we must understand that similarly to liberal capitalism, inequality is the cornerstone of society. But unlike liberal capitalism, neoliberalism's economic policies create inequality relative to that of the material conditions, which I will discuss in part 3. The most economically desperate are forced to live on the streets in urban and suburban slums, while those who are now considered the middle class are forced to work longer hours for less pay, little to no benefits or retirement, and especially in the COVID-19 pandemic, we are seeing the idea of job security becoming a thing of the past. As to be expected with these kind of economic conditions, the gig economy has soared as an industry for many during the development of the last year, offering little in terms of benefits, consistent pay being sporadic, and just a strenuous toll on those who are already down on their luck. From a neoliberal's perspective, though, this is perfect because people are employed through their own free choice. They compete for the pay they wish to earn, and there is little to no intervention needed to regulate these practices, because there's competition amongst the industry. This seems like individual freedom, given the parameters previously stated, but at the end of the day, society is still, and in the case of those people employed in the gig economy, literally chained to the market. And the will of the markets will decide if people earn enough to eat, to house, or to live. Holding to the idea that the market becomes the chains of a neoliberal society, we can consider the second critique, the unethical commercialization and subsequent commodification of things. What does that mean? The claim is that marketization contributes to human exploitation and degradation because it limits or stratifies access to what ought to be broadly accessible and shared, or because it enables something intrinsically horrific or severely denigrating to the planet. Some of the best examples can come in 3 forms. Baby surrogates from nations that have been subjected to colonization and imperialism specifically for the benefit of wealthy first world parents. This is human exploitation and degradation. Things like education, what ought to be broadly accessible and shared, have been pushed to be publicly funded and provided to everyone if they choose to do so, by many for a very long time. But as we look around, that's not something we can say for the entire globe, nor is it something we can say for the entirety of Western culture, where schooling generally stops around 18 years of age, if you're lucky. Privatized educational institutions isn't where it stops, though. I'm sure you're aware of a company in education called Pearson. Even when education access is public, materials and curriculums are subject to privatization. Thirdly, we can look at environmental sustainability and ecological. I think it's ecological. You know what? Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. Ecological preservation has been tainted by this commercialization. This is an example of it enabling something intrinsically horrific or severely denigrating to the planet. No amount of trees planted or forests preserved will be able to combat the impact of industrialization, mass transportation, and the use of natural resources. But the feeling of helping has become an industry in and of itself. In the third critique, as a result of state financial focus being on that of the free market, we see an increase in corporate and financial capital having its influence on the state and its actions. Social democrats like Bernie Sanders have been preaching for decades, calling for an end to corruption in politics, specifically through policies to limit the possibility of corporate entities to buy or influence political votes for their own gain. Often this is under the umbrella catchphrase of get money out of politics. While this specifically means different things to different people in terms of implementing and execution, the general sentiment that neoliberal policy has left this huge oversight gets in the way of freedom of the masses, giving more validity to the critique, as it shows that this issue is so prevailingly obvious that it holds bipartisan support in American politics, but as we'll see, usually under populist movements. Lastly, under neoliberal policy, we see a focus on economic havoc. In the three previous critiques, in combination, they create a weakened economy by the ascendance and liberty of finance capital, especially the destabilizing effects of the inherent bubbles and other dramatic fluctuations of financial markets. The most recent economic crisis came during the 2008-2009 housing market crash and its economic downward spiral. Many out of work, housing, and in desperate search for anything that would help them get through the economic crisis, Occupy Wall Street, Southern European protests, and the anti-globalization movement came out of this economic turmoil. Seemingly, the financial crash of 2008-2009 would be the ripe conditions for left-wing radicalization that many Marxists had dreamed of for centuries. And with the added conditions we have for mass communication, possibility for organization of the masses had never been easier. So why over 10 years later did 70 million people vote for an overt reactionary, and while many others still support the status quo of individualism and economic deregulatory practices? Let's look into that. Wealth inequality is a pervasive problem worldwide. While other countries and regions have wider gaps than others, or have varying ratios between economic classes, the problems which stem from this fundamental inequality show themselves very similarly. Throughout the 1700s, we saw many of the great monarchies fall or severely diminish as the idea of absolute monarchy was questioned by people across the globe. With the inequalities overtly present in everyday society under feudalism, violent change in leadership was seen in many countries across the world, with revolutions being done by the peasantry and often led by wealthy landowners. This crucial oversight and structure led to what was known as mercantilism and then eventually capitalism. While the structure of society was changed and moved from a single bloodline of rulership to forms of liberal representative democracy, the dreams of many revolutionaries never came to fruition, as the very power structures that they sought to dismantle just reshaped themselves under different economic structures. The observations they made about the changes society had found itself undergoing have proven to stand the test of time, as economists and sociologists still have these texts in their libraries to this day. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels undertook the task of analyzing these very power structures that had reformed themselves under a new economic structure, the contradictions they presented, the inequalities they created, and the liberation it barred people from. Now, in fear of giving the wrong impression, I do have to note that there were a great deal of thinkers who came up with similar ideas and conclusions, and it's likely humans would have come up with these regardless. To disregard the economic access and privilege of both Marx and Engels would be extremely hypocritical with what we are about to discuss. In the latter half of the 1800s, when the Industrial Revolution had integrated itself into Western society, mostly Western Europe and the United States, the same economic injustices that we saw during the rule of monarchs were still being observed and recorded as a reality for many people living during this time. In England, Engels compiled a book called The Conditions of the Working Class in England. Catchy title, I know. Here, he breaks down the lived experiences, the political landscape, and the inequalities of the working class in England, and the inequalities of the working class in England during the mid to late 1800s. A major concern of his dealt with the alienation of the worker, as well as the physical division of classes within society. Every great city has one or more slums, where the working class is crowded together. True poverty often dwells in hidden alleys close to palaces of the rich, but In general, a separate territory has been assigned to it, where, removed from the sight of the happier classes, it may struggle along as it may. Separating people by their given voice in society, that being how much they're allowed by ruling classes to have an impact on the greater society, has occurred for a large portion of human history as far back as we've gathered together. But this was so much so that part of public health was dedicated to cleanliness, as conditions like these were recorded. Common lodging houses, too, are very numerous. The character of the houses and their guests is the same as in other cities. 5 to 7 beds in each room lie on the floor without bedsteads, and on these sleep, mixed indiscriminately, as many persons as apply. Because of living conditions like these, sickness and disease were rampant, especially for those who were most economically vulnerable. But Engels also observed the working class's feelings of entrapment or enslavement to their bosses as a result of the living conditions and working conditions, where the proletarian has no other choice than that of either accepting the conditions which the bourgeoisie offers him, or of starving, of freezing to death, of sleeping naked amongst the beasts of the forests. This can sound eerily familiar to the realities that many people face to this day. And while Engels wasn't the first to make these observations, his detailed documentation of Victorian England is invaluable as long as we take into account the biases he may have had. What's more interesting, though, is that we have recorded accounts of very similar situations in other areas of the world, which tells us that these problems are more likely the symptoms of a larger issue. Around the exact same time, across an ocean, in New York City, a reporter and photographer by the name of Jacob Riis began documenting a series of photographs, sketches, and accounts from working-class people living in the city. The Industrial Revolution had integrated itself into American city life just as it did in England. The faster production rate and increased innovation in technology had made profits skyrocket for the bourgeois class. All the while, the working people had been left to their impoverished lives. In 8 years, 135,595 families in New York were registered as asking or receiving charity. It is not even pretended that the record is complete. To be well within the limits, the Society's statisticians allow only 3.5 to the family, instead of 4.5 that are accepted as the standard. Now, this isn't inherently bad. Asking for help should never be seen as a source of shame, but we should note that, mentioned earlier, we saw a rise in innovation, a boom in profits. We should see numbers like these diminish, if not reduced to zero. Because of this and the similarities of the working class of the English, we see similar living conditions. The 135,595 families inhabited no fewer than 31,000 different tenants. I say tenants advisedly, though. The Society calls them buildings, because at least 99% were found to be in the big barracks, the rest in shanties scattered here and there, and now and then a fraud or an exceptional case of distress in a dwelling house of better class. As time progressed, we see the living conditions increase, but we still see the same wealth inequalities, leaving the working class in the same crucial dilemma that Marx described as their chains. Fast forward nearly 2 centuries, and former economics professor at Harvard University, John Galbraith, writes his most acclaimed book, The Affluent Society, where he breaks down and dissects post-World War II societies, and how we can gain mass amounts of wealth in the private sector, the part of the national economy that the government doesn't control, and remain so poor in the public sector, the part of the national economy the government does control. And the same problems we saw throughout the Industrial Revolution still persist. For poverty does survive. In part, it is a physical matter. Those afflicted have such limited and insufficient food, such poor clothing, such crowded, cold, and dirty shelter that life is painful as well as comparatively brief. Charming. Understanding that this isn't just an issue of relative poverty, we can't deal with this as an issue of absolute. Galbraith discusses further how this actually continues the cycle of poverty when those whose income falls behind that of their community, not being able to get themselves out of poverty due to falling behind the minimum needed within their communities, we can examine them through 2 theories of poverty, case poverty and insular poverty. Case poverty is commonly and properly related to some characteristic of the individuals so afflicted, but some quality peculiar to the individual or family involved mental deficiency, bad health, inability to adapt to the discipline of industrial life, uncontrollable procreation, alcohol, discrimination involving a very limited minority, some educational handicap unrelated to community shortcoming, or perhaps a combination or several of these handicaps, has kept these individuals from participating in the general well-being. Case poverty accounts for a majority of the stereotypical images of poverty. The trailer park communities, farmhouse families, or even just rural communities far outside the reaches of any metropolitan area. Insular poverty is a little bit harder to nail down, as it may manifest itself in larger groups of people and perpetuated through systemic failings, creating a new norm which manifests itself as an island of poverty. In the island, everyone or nearly everyone is poor. Here, evidently, it is not easy to explain matters by individual inadequacy. We may mark individuals down as intrinsically deficient in social performance. It is not proper or even wise so to characterize an entire community. The people of the island have been frustrated by some factor common to their environment. Poverty theories, such as case poverty that we first discussed, tend to be the focus of many, those looking to treat the symptoms as an issue of self-responsibility, oftentimes making it a formula for keeping the suffering of others from causing suffering to themselves. Since poverty is the result of the deficiencies, including the moral shortcomings of the persons concerned, it is possible to shift the responsibility to them. They are worthless, and as a simple manifestation of social justice, they suffer for it. This rescues those afflicted from the worst consequences of their inadequacy or misfortune. No larger social change or reorganization is suggested. Except, as it may be insufficient in its generosity, the society is not at fault. Case poverty is often a way that's used to dismiss systemic issues. And while ignorant to dismiss case poverty as just a theory, this shift in perspective allows us to consider these not as mere problems, but symptoms of a larger issue affecting vast groups of people, creating insecurity and skepticism in the world around them. This often leads to distrust in governing bodies, increases in violence, and rising activity in hate groups specifically targeting minorities. In the US, poverty is defined as an individual making less than $35 a day or a family of 4 making less than $70 a day. Now, this is all relative as we've mentioned before, but for a rough comparison for what was discussed in How the Other Half Lives, over the course of 8 years, 135,595 families in New York City were recorded as needing assistance. So we can approximate about 500,000 people in a city whose population was only 1.5 million were being driven to beg for food or accept it in a form of charity at some point during those 8 years, if not the whole time. With the data from the Charity Organization Society, we can see that in the city of New York, approximately 6.4% qualified for continuous economic relief, 24.4% for temporary relief to get out of poverty, and 52.2% needed only employment to get themselves out of poverty. Since the 1960s, the United States has tracked poverty based on poverty thresholds. And using this data, we can see that the last decade held an average unemployment rate of 6.24%, and people living below the poverty line at an average of 13.55%. Here, we can roughly see the similarities and differences in the data, where we've already come and where we possibly have left to go. Now, it's important to note that we should be as holistic as possible and consider not only every aspect, but how they collaborate and intertwine together. Wealth inequalities isn't the only thing that brings pressure on those living under it. As of time of filming, we are nearly 70 years from what marks the end of World War II. I continually bring up a post-World War II society. Why is this? Because of the pivot, not only economically, but socially. This has occurred and shaped itself politically in the decades following the atrocities of the last World War. And we need to consider that many systems of oppression and authority will compete with each other, but also, when it's applicable, work together. To complete this idea, we need to talk about the normalization and romanticizing of the nostalgic memory of masculinity throughout the 20th and 21st century. Now, not to clutter this up with a video inside of a video, I'm just going to briefly go over what gender is for our purposes here. In brief, gender and its role in society can be described as performative. What do I mean by this? That is to say, gender is a repetition of words and actions over time. But Candace West and Don Zimmerman want us to take this a step further, making the case that while it's performative, it's also relational, in the sense that it is performed for the expectations of others. In particular, the patriarchal society that we live in puts masculinity and its desired characteristics above all else, permeating it throughout society so that it touches and works in tandem with everything. When these expectations are not met, negative ramifications are more often than not given to an individual being branded socially as a thwarted masculine person. Moore defines thwarting in relation to gender as the inability to sustain or properly take up a gendered subject position. The concept of thwarted masculinity does not treat masculinity as a fixed thing that one can or cannot do. Rather, thwarted masculinity presumes that gender is always performed against often unrealistic ideals. In turn, one's gender performance is often always characterized by inadequacies and failures. People are expected to be responsible for how they act in accordance to gender norms of a particular setting. So what does masculinity have to do with poverty theory, the stock market, and any of the events following the 2020 election? Nostalgia is often defined as a yearning for the past. Though, nostalgia isn't just fondly looking back at the past, but includes idealizing and mythologizing history itself. Doubling down and creating even higher expectations for gender, through the lens of nostalgia, we start to see elements of what Umberto Eco wrote about in his essay, Fascism. Elements of machismo and rejection of modernity. This is especially important within the context of how we view masculinity in our post-World War II society. In their 2017 essay, Masculinity Nostalgia, Mackenzie and Foster argue masculinity nostalgia mythologizes peace as a time of patriarchal power, authority, and gender certainty. Masculinity nostalgia is both the yearning for an idealized, secure, and peaceful time in which gender roles were presumed to have been clear and uncontested, and a quest to reclaim patriarchal power and authority, in contrast to the daily reminders that gender identities are measured against impossible ideals that one can never live up to. Masculinity nostalgia looks to a supposed perfect, peaceful time when, finally, one could successfully perform masculinity. With seemingly no grandiose narratives and epic battles of honor to be fought, where does this leave masculinity and its supposed intended role for society? Pair this question with the economic inequality seen throughout the globe, not only through case poverty, but through the systemic lens of insular poverty, a deep-seated separation of large communities that can contribute to the normalization of poverty, as well as cast blame and distrust in governing bodies as a result. Furthermore, these governing bodies creating economic policies trusting markets over people. And after decades of this combined assault, what are the consequences? Especially after a sudden global pandemic and a pending economic crash on the horizon. January 6, 2021 resulted in a breaching of the United States Capitol by various right-wing groups with goals that have been slowly revealed by federal agencies in the weeks following the riot. Some had intentions to take hostages, use explosives, and even destroy ballots needed to officiate the 2020 election results. With these anti-establishment sentiments towards the United States government, many mainstream outlets have referred to these groups as anarchists. Now, twice in 1 month, we've seen these words find their way onto mainstream media. And we've seen some striking actions of right-wing organization. It would be foolish to look at these events in a vacuum, so let's examine key events leading to what occurred in relation to radicalization and devout belief in ideology. In the months preceding March of 2020, the United States and the rest of the world had received warnings of a virus emerging from China. Naturally, humans having a difficulty fathoming exponential numbers and growth, so the response to this global pandemic was non-existent at worst and extremely delayed at best in most developed nations. Countries considered impoverished being forced to rely on the help of others, usually at some sort of cost, and those who had been left out to dry by the world have all been but forgotten by Western countries. Shortly after its emergence, it was documented and recorded as COVID-19. The World Health Organization started to monitor the virus with the help from the Chinese government.
Immediately, this led to reactionary Western media to create coverage of the developing virus using a xenophobic perspective, all the while demonizing the World Health Organization for association and collaboration with the Chinese government. By March of 2020, the virus had been positively identified in the United States, as well as many other countries around the world. While many leaders of nations had started formulating plans to combat the virus and its spread, many more sat back in awe as their worst fears came knocking at their doorstep. Or maybe that'll be the way some of the most privileged would like to remember this as. But this is all old news if you've been around for the last year. And we know that in particular, United States senators and many high-ranking officials knew the risk and severity of the virus and chose to do the most sensible action to protect what our nation holds so close to its heart. They quickly began moving their money, their investments, and their financial assets to protect themselves. With the information given to them about an upcoming virus, especially one that has the ability to disrupt an economy that millions upon millions of people have become accustomed to, in order to prepare themselves for the economic fallout that would surely follow. Not something anyone had really seen since the 2008-2009 crash. As the money started moving, the news started to break, and the pandemonium began to ensue. Grocery stores were left barren, gas stations started running out of gas, and unemployment started to skyrocket. Businesses closed because in order to stop the spread of the virus, you need to lock down places that have a lot of traffic. Many developed nations started month-long plans in order to slow the spread, coming up with ways to keep their citizens from traveling, gathering in large groups, and just kind of keeping them separated as long as it was needed, because the safety of their people was important. And many of these countries continued this until they could resume what was somewhat similar to normal life. Many of this was economically funded through monthly allowances, or as they've been referred to as stimulus checks, giving people the ability to pay rent, to eat, and to live, all while being able to stop the spread of a virus. But many nations scrambled to find ways to keep businesses open, to keep the economy running, with little regard for health and safety of their people. As to be expected, the death toll rose, as well as unemployment. Sales were continuing, but we saw many industries crashing. All the while the United States, while at the time of writing, we just surpassed 500,000 deaths due to COVID-19. Politicians continued campaigning, accepting money and donations, and pushing the same neoliberal policies through Congress. While some expressed concern about the virus at best, many others downright denied the existence of it at all at worst. Economic relief, and as well as healthcare programs, started to become slashed. And talks of creating quick economic relief through stimulus checks became increasingly grim. And if you were to poll the average American, without mentioning anyone's political party affiliation or position within government, about the decisions of these people, likely many people would try to understand or at least rationalize why they did what they did. Because neoliberalism isn't just about economic or foreign policy. It's those actions which in turn reflect the belief many hold deep down about how we view the world, our interactions, and relations with individuals around us. This is what's philosophically known as ideology. So, when you consider neoliberalism to be the prevailing ideology in Western capitalist countries, you can use using the previous symptoms and critiques from previous sections, it becomes a lot more clear that even during a ravaging global pandemic, little to no economic relief is provided to those who need it the most. And as business as usual attitudes are exhibited by elected officials, millions of people can turn a blind eye and be ignorant to the injustices being done to them. All right, I need to get out of this. This is God. Though I do like the red lighting. This is kind of fun. Maybe we can turn it up a bit. Oh yeah. All right. Cool. Louis Althusser was a French Marxist who dedicated most of his life to Marx and how to make him more understandable as a philosopher, with work spanning decades and theories being formulated over the course of that time. And the reading I want to focus on has to do with what many leftists have been asking all along. Why aren't people becoming left-wing radicals? The conditions are right for this to happen. Are they just stupid? The answer is a little bit more complicated than that, and maybe I can shed some light on that and answer why, during a pandemic of all things, we've seen working class band together, but for reactionary populist causes, like that of the Capitol riots on January the 6th, as well as economic targeting in the stock market just 2 weeks later in that month. While the turmoil and crisis over the last year has played a critical role in radicalizing masses towards fighting back against injustices, some have also found the source to be that of the wealthy. But it has been for reactionary causes and not for egalitarian liberation in the Marxist sense. In the course of the last year, we've seen an increase in right-wing violence through organized militia and organization online and in person. Althusser puts forth this theory of ideology, and I want to focus on the application of them on the social and economic climate that we've discussed so far. Having discussed the policies of America both economically and socially, as well as the conditions of the people both economically and socially, we can get to work in the application process. Althusser puts forth two theses that he stands by. The first making the claim that ideology has a material existence. At first, this claim can seem kind of absurd. An ideology is just an assertion of a worldview, something that exists in the minds of anywhere from billions of people to just one. So how can that be a material object? To truly grasp this concept, we need to understand that Althusser was a staunch post-humanist. Without bogging down this video with another video, let's briefly cover what that means. Post-humanism is a way of viewing humanity. Any theory that is critical of traditional humanism and traditional ideas about humanity and the human condition. Critical of the foundational assumptions of humanism and its legacy that examines and questions the historical notions of human and human nature. In short, post-humanists are highly critical of human nature, a term that is changed and molded to match the certain culture or time period. They recognize many of the fundamental ideas and frameworks used from religion and science have been used to distinguish humans from any other thing on Earth or in the universe. Those can all be boiled down to biased perceptions through the lens of human exceptionalism. Things such as human reason starts to become questioned or even erased. And most of what is considered human nature is really just a reflection of the material conditions of either the civilization, the society, or even just the group of people therewith. When nature and reason are questioned like this, the idea that those can be used to guide our decision-making isn't as concrete of an idea. Now, let's return to Althusser's claim. Ideology has a material existence. What does this mean in a post-humanist perspective? Humanism would tell us that we can make rational decisions as long as it's in accordance with our nature. The individual in question behaves in such and such a way, adopts such and such a practical attitude, and, what is more, participates in certain regular practices, which are those of the ideological apparatus, on which depend the ideas which he has in all consciousness freely chosen as a subject. Ideology is itself forced to recognize that every subject endowed with a consciousness and believing in the ideas that his consciousness inspires in him and freely accepts must act according to his ideas, must therefore inscribe on his own ideas as a free subject in the actions of his material practice. Agreeing with this, we can understand that most people will formulate their beliefs around their actions rather than their actions around their beliefs. There's an old joke that kind of demonstrates what I'm talking about here, and it goes like this. So there's this man being drafted into the army, but because he does not want to serve, he fakes being mentally unstable to be considered unfit to serve. He chooses to demonstrate this by compulsively checking every single piece of paper he can get his hands on and loudly proclaiming, "No, this isn't it." When he's sent to the military psychiatrist, he starts looking at all the papers, still saying, "No, this isn't it." When the psychiatrist is convinced he really is mentally unstable, they write him a letter dismissing him from military service. The man looks at this piece of paper and gleefully claims, "This is it." And we can see from this joke that the material object finally affirmed his proclaimed beliefs. This circular way of viewing the world, by creating beliefs around actions, is what Althusser calls. By creating beliefs around actions is what Althusser is referring about. The circular way of viewing the world by attaching beliefs to actions is what Althusser is trying to get across when he says ideology has a material existence. Let's look at an example from a real interaction in 2017, setting the precedent for the next 4 years of his presidency, specifically how right-wing authority, both in media and elected officials, will demonstrate this material ideology. Shortly after his inauguration, Donald Trump claimed that the United States murder rate was at a 47-year high, when, in contrast, the Uniform Crime Report from the FBI showed that the murder rate was actually at a near historic low. CNN's Alison Camerata
challenged this claim on air by discussing it with the Trump administration's stand-in, Newt Gingrich. And the interaction went something like this. Violent crime is down. The economy is ticking up. It is not down in the biggest cities. Violent crime, murder rate is down. It is down. Then how come it's up in Chicago, and up in Baltimore, and up in Washington? There are pockets where certainly we aren't tackling murder. Your national capital, your third biggest city, but violent crime across the nation is down. The average American, I bet you this morning, does not think crime is down, does not think we're safer, but it is. We are safer, and it is down. No, that's just your view. It's a fact. These are the national FBI facts. But what I said is also a fact. The current view is that liberals have a whole set of statistics that theoretically may be right, but it's not where human beings are. But what you're saying, but hold on, Mr. Speaker, because you're saying liberals use these numbers. They use this sort of magic math. These are the FBI statistics. They're not a liberal organization. They're a crime-fighting organization. No. But what I said is equally true. People feel more threatened. Feel it? Yes, they feel it, but their facts don't support it. As a political candidate, I'll go with how the people feel, and let you go with the theoreticians. This interaction is a perfect example of what I was just discussing. Both people are exemplifying the political ideology they are attached to. On the one hand, we have Camerata, the liberal status quo, against Gingrich, the conservative reactionary. While both are starting with the same thing, they're both coming to the table with a different argument. And it's this fundamental misrecognition that we want to focus on. While Camerata becomes the surrogate for liberalism, looking to data published as her material object, that violent crime, more specifically murder rates, are down when measured against other years, Gingrich becomes the surrogate for conservatism, using the emotional state of Americans to back the choices made by the president. Something that's less measurable than data or statistics, but if we consider Althusser, not less relevant. If ideology is material, as Althusser claims, the emotions of the masses does hold weight, as it'll perpetuate the actions of those who believe it. Now, after the statistics are stated, Gingrich decides to counter this by stating that larger cities are not seeing this decline as the rest of the nation. Camerata counters this by bringing up that this is cherry-picked evidence, and we're looking at the national statistics. It doesn't hold weight as an empirical claim. At this point, the first gotcha has happened. Gingrich now changes his approach in asserting his ideology and brings the ball to his court, bringing to light the importance of how Americans feel. That safety is more about the feeling of security rather than actual numbers. This is where Camerata says the data doesn't match what you're saying, and he says that's just your view. And it's at this point I just want to scream, yes! Because it's at this line we almost see ideology recognize itself. Both are using words that have seemingly lost meaning given no ideological context. Safety is the big one being used here especially. The important takeaway isn't about who's right or wrong. They both are. When arguing between significantly increasing police spending in areas predominantly populated by Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or increasing spending at an accepted rate in areas predominantly populated by Black, Indigenous, and people of color, your best bet is to abolish the police. But I digress. It's that the ideology that they both entered with, they both exited with. And the only thing that changed was the interchangeability of empirical arguments and idealistic arguments. And once it was recognized that they were both arguing for very different ideas, data for crime or feelings of safety, it concludes with a near realization of ideology itself. Slavoj Žižek, who uses ideas Althusser put forth on ideology, goes further and would say that this is the split subject. Everyone runs into this contradiction between what they know and what they believe. What is acceptable to show and what can only be known through coded language and slips of the tongue. Both agree that what the other is saying is true, but it doesn't match their ideology. So no matter how factual either of them may be, it goes against either of them to follow through past this recognition. When a subject looks at their world, they can create beliefs to give explanation to what they do and why they do it. Concluding this on two key ideas, Althusser says, There is no practice except by and in an ideology, and there is no ideology except by the subject and for the subjects. This leads into Althusser's main thesis and what's going to tie all of this together. Ideology interpolates individuals as subjects. Alright, so what does that mean? Althusser uses this as a definitive interpretation of what was previously stated. There is no ideology except by the subject and for the subjects. Ideology is kind of a hollow thing. It only exists as long as it's created by people and created for those people. Without the subject, ideology would not exist. But in turn, this also means that without ideology, subjugation does not exist. And that's kind of the scariest part. When we consider the economic and social conditions of everyday Americans and the economic policies implemented by the American government, we can see where the perpetuation towards reactionary populist sentiments and ideology comes from. A long history of insular poverty in the West creates inequalities that become normalized, and from that, increased skepticism for the greater world around them. This often leads to distrust in governing bodies and increases in violence, causing policies to be put into place that are used to combat net losses in GDP. This may be in the form of offering financial assistance towards education so people can fight case poverty, but not insular poverty. And this is often through the cost of something like military service. Or instead of mandating a federal minimum wage that reflects the economic needs, standards of living, and the inflated value of the dollar, they may instead let businesses compete, fighting one another over what they'll make their minimum wage. This creates a whole new market for businesses to fight against each other. All the while, they're competing for employees who are just trying to make it paycheck to paycheck. This leads to politicians who will go with the major donors of their parties, even if it doesn't match their own deeply held beliefs, justifying their choices whether it lines up with data or feelings. It is this split between what is known and what is believed between the people and the governing officials that creates these tensions that we've seen lead up to violence, riots, and everything else that has broken out as of January 2021. And it's these exact same sentiments that will drive further organization in the coming years.
Right-wing populist movements are a result of the neoliberal ideology that rules most capitalist nations today. As Zizek would refer to the split subject, we can use this to examine movements in the same way. Both the capital rioters and the stock market organizers use very similar language, such as reclaiming rights, freedom, and justice. And here lies the language of neoliberalism. It holds these words in high regard. But the beliefs held by the individuals executing these acts shows that they aren't interpreting these words in the same way. And it's this fundamental misrecognition that online leftists are mistakenly trying to co-opt. The stock market actions were more subtle. Anonymity of online action has to contribute to this. But when examining the language used and the actions carried out, we can all trace this back to the split subject of neoliberalism. On the one hand, we have the known, the conscious, or the accepted. This is those reclaiming rights, freedom, justice. And on the other hand, we have the unconscious, the belief, the deeply held. And it's this unconscious that executed the acts of anti-establishment beliefs. We can view neoliberalism as a split subject, one of conscious liberalism and the other of unconscious anarcho-capitalism. The accepted known and the held belief. Through this contradiction creates a misrecognition where motives seem unclear by the use of shared language. This is where both the media and the masses get the interpretation wrong. Most will look at either the language or the actions to justify the position they choose to critique or praise, when in actuality, neither give the full picture of what's going on ideologically. Right-wing populism isn't a crusade for democracy, nor is it a fight for justice. It is the product of and execution of neoliberalism. Markets represent individual freedom and therefore are the highest law of the land. And the government is at fault for hindering this. The ideas of freedom, democracy, and justice only hold value as long as they uphold this crucial tenet. When right-wing populists come to a head with liberal values and anarcho-capitalist practices, the contradictions can boil over until an act is carried out to break this tension. In a recent Wall Street Journal poll, 76% of people 18 and over weren't confident that the future is going to be brighter than the past. With little in terms of hopes economically or socially, nostalgia for a greater past can become a driving factor. Far-left advocates think that the anti-establishment sentiments from right-wing populism can be co-opted for the benefit of class consciousness. But fundamentally, this is near impossible, when considering the long history of insular poverty leading liberalism and capitalism to create neoliberalism. Perpetuated through policy and creating the material conditions to affirm this ideology, a split subject is torn between liberalism and anarcho-capitalism. In the West, we are closer to a far-right organized uprising rather than a far-left organized uprising. While the problems the far-right and left observe are the same, the sources to those problems are not, and it is this misrecognition that creates the ideological tension, making the co-opt of these individuals impossible in its current state. Not only that, but if neoliberalism is left unchanged and unchecked, as it is already shown with the Biden administration maintaining the status quo, we may see more right-wing populist movements rise up in the coming decade. The coming wealth inequality is certain to follow the COVID-19 global pandemic, perpetuating the cycle of anti-establishment and populist movements. Right-wing ideas still have a tight grip on our society, both economically and socially, and trying to co-opt this after the events have occurred won't work. Beliefs are shaped by actions, and if the actions have already been committed, trying to convince them that those actions actually mean something else than what they already believed will not work. The double reflection of actions matching your beliefs, and vice versa, is a strong driver of ideology that most will go their whole lives misunderstanding or not even considering. The real hope here lies in the possibility of bringing to light the recognition of ideology, realizing our own instances, as well as having those conversations with others. As Zizek concludes in his book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, he accepts ideology in its utter, meaningless idiocracy. He keeps open the gap between ideology and its symbolization. The subject is subject only insofar as he presumes himself as absolute through the movement of double reflection. I just want to thank everyone who took the time to watch all of this. Any questions? Leave them down below. Any suggestions? Leave them down below. Any critiques? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Leave it down below. I'm definitely going to be following this up with a few others. I've already got another essay in the works. Should be seeing that either the end of this month or the beginning of next. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and what's a good sign off? I should have a good sign off. Workers of the world, unite. Let's go on outtakes.